Hey folks, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on the show. Are your training methods preventing injury or causing them? Why do some athletic pursuits lead to orthorexia, disordered eating, and body image issues? As the years tick by, how can we move the goalposts to make sure that we're training for the right reasons? One of my favorite things about hosting this podcast for the past 12 plus years is the chance to revisit with guests in different stages of their lives. Longtime listeners first met my friend Chaz a little more than a decade ago. This dude is a lifelong athlete and beast. Back then, in his mid-20s, Chaz was fresh off his first bodybuilding competition, where he achieved an astonishing 3.5% body fat naturally and earned his place on the podium. Now in his late 30s, it's fascinating to examine how our lives and goals have changed. Before we get to the interview, did you know that artificial blue light from screens disrupts our body's natural production of melatonin by up to 60%, which can lead to poor sleep and mitochondrial damage? If you'd like to protect your eyes from the most problematic wavelengths of artificial light, take a gander at our premium blue blocking glasses from WildRx. My Aura Ring sleep data agrees that wearing these blue blockers after sundown makes a massive positive difference in sleep quality. And as a thanks for being a loyal listener, you can use the code WILD20 for an extra 20% off your entire order. Right now, we're only in the US, but if you'd like to grab your discount on some of the highest quality blue blockers around, just visit wildrx.com and use the code WILD20 and you'll get 20% off your order. And of course, if you find this free show valuable and you have a quick moment, please hit that like button, click subscribe, share this show with someone you care about, or for bonus points, leave a quick review on Apple Podcasts. You rock. All right, on this episode with Chaz, you'll discover how Chaz navigated body image issues and disordered eating patterns following a successful bodybuilding competition, how to adjust your training and goals in the face of serious injury, why some ultramarathoners show no signs of degeneration or injury after a lifetime of running, what it's like to experiment in the Wild West world of peptides, and much, much more. Let's go hang out with Chaz. Welcome back, folks. Returning to the show today is our good friend Chaz Branham, a venture capitalist, athlete, and lifelong health nut, who you may remember back in 2013 entered into the Texas Shredder Classic, his first bodybuilding competition, on a dare, and did ridiculously well and even earned a spot on the podium by using a fat-based approach. Chaz, how's it going, man?
Good to see you, Abel. It's good to be here again. I think it's a full 10 years later.
10 years later. So I was just rewatching that first interview, and it's like, we're babies back then. It's and we could talk a little bit about that today, because as health nuttery extends from our teen years to our 20s, when we met in our 20s, to now I'm looking at 40 pretty soon, and you're in your late 30s. A lot of things change and adapt. We have to move our own goalposts. So maybe you can kind of do a quick recap of your experience in athletics, bodybuilding, etc., and then we can talk about everything that's transpired since.
Yeah, of course. I mean, for me, I grew up in a play sports, varsity letter type of environment, where I was playing 3 sports and started training for those at a pretty young age. And once I kind of got later into high school and learned about lifting weights, I went from like no lifting weights to becoming completely obsessed with lifting weights. And I tell this story. My dad got me this membership to Gold's Gym, and I wasn't going. And it was my junior year of high school. And it'd been like 3 or 4 months, and he announced that he was canceling my membership. And he's like, "You're not using it. I'm going to cancel it." And we got in this huge fight, like really good high school dad son fight.
Oh yeah, those are the good ones.
Ego flexing, and I'm like, "I'm gonna go every day, like I'll show you." And so I started going every day, kind of out of spite. And I started getting really curious, and he saw that I was going regularly, and he bought me the Encyclopedia Bodybuilding, which I actually still have on my shelf. It's fallen apart, and it's got pages like flopping out of it and highlight and earmarks. And I went through the whole book in about 2 days, I think. And that was sort of the beginning, because Arnold wrote this like Bible for how to lift weights, how to eat, how to supplement, how to, create a training regimen and a split, which to me, when I was going in the gym at that point in my life, it felt like talking to your accountant or a mechanic. It's like, hey, so we found that you need an alternator in your bearings. And you're like, I mean, those all sound important. I guess I'll do that.
Yeah.
That was kind of the way the gym felt. It was like I walk in, I'd watch people do stuff, try to sort of mirror them, but I had no idea how to put things together. And so that kind of launched me. Of course, it was an encyclopedia of bodybuilding. So it was very catered to kind of sculpting the body for aesthetic purposes and to try to kind of maximize those effects. And started realizing that that was not necessarily conducive to training for athletics. And so I started discovering different modalities, and I stumbled across this really weird method called CrossFit back in like 2004. I think I discovered it my senior year of high school. And CrossFit was not the CrossFit that we all have come to know. It was still this very small kind of bespoke program run by this gymnastics coach that had all these weird ideas, for mashing together all these different types of athletic capabilities into one training regimen. And I thought it was brilliant. And so I started using sort of CrossFit Journal information. I literally printed every single article they had on the CrossFit Journal, put them in little binders, and had them in a shelf in my dorm room in undergrad. And that's what I used for my own training when I started playing rugby, because I stopped playing football after high school and kind of got recruited to play with the Pepperdine Club. It was just a rugby club, but I loved it. And also continued to give me a reason to train in an intense manner. And I started using the CrossFit Olympic lifting regimens and kind of mashing them with what I learned from Arnie in the encyclopedia, and kind of started to create my own. I called it athletic shaping. I was like training athletically, but I still like to look good. So there's a little bit of the bodybuilding in there with the athletic training. And, I started getting really into like finding ways to lift as much as possible.
Yeah, sure did.
And I started really getting into powerlifting with the CrossFit, with some of the bodybuilding. And that was kind of my training method for about a decade. And when I did the bodybuilding show, it was really awkward because my strength numbers just went through the floor, especially in that last month. And it was just really interesting seeing how difficult it was to train when you're kind of in a calorie deficit experience. And, also emotions get affected when you're really trying to peel off those extra tiny, tenths of a percent of body fat towards the show day. And eventually, the powerlifting, CrossFit, and the bodybuilding, I started to experience a lot of injuries, recurring injuries. And, I was deadlifting. I think the most I ever deadlifted was a little over 800. I was squatting well over 500 pounds. Like, I was a big guy. I was like 230 to 240 at that time. I've been as big as like 245, 250. Right now I'm about 200 to 205. So some variation there. But, these back injuries especially, I started getting all these like little lumbar SI things, sort of affects my hips, and feel it kind of wrap around to the front, and really wasn't sure what was going on. And every time I'd get hurt or have like a little bit of a setback, A, I wouldn't really know what was causing it. And B, I'd have to go see a PT, a chiro, an acupuncturist, a body worker. I'd have to spend like $1,000 to $2,000 just to like make the rounds before anybody had anything to share with me. Like, hey, here's what we think's going on, or here's what we think you should do to try to kind of rectify this injury. And it just started to get kind of maddening, and it was happening every couple of months, kind of towards the end of this cycle for me. And I started to feel like every time I went in the gym, I didn't know what was going to happen. And, I'd get under the bar, do squats or some kind of Olympic movement. And I had this like really frightening visual of my body folding in half. And it was because like, the brain body connection, like there was something not right. Like there was some inefficiency, and, I was not paying attention to the warning signals. And eventually, I was doing a very moderate work set with squats, back squats. And I got to the bottom of the movement, and it felt like someone stabbed me, kind of in that SI joint with like a saber. And it was this like extremely acute, sharp pain. Immediately bailed on the weight. I'm laying on the ground, kind of flopping around like a fish because my back is in full spasm. And I'm just laying there, and the only thought I'm having is this was completely avoidable. And this is my fault. Like, there's nobody else to blame than me. I'm the guy that creates my own programming. I'm the one in here lifting. I'm the one on the floor flopping around. And I'm like, this isn't going to work. Like, I don't want to be a 40-year-old man talking about what I used to do in the gym while I'm like wheeling around in my wheelchair. And I knew that would be the future for me, but I also didn't know what to do about it. And it was kind of confusing being an expert, or at least I considered myself an expert on lifting, nutrition, and being smart and taking care of the tissue and repairing it. And here I was, like, dealing with what felt like a very, very severe injury. I was like, okay, I got to go back to the drawing board. Like, if I want to continue enjoying my meat suit for the long haul and not replace a bunch of parts along the way, I got to do something different, because what got me here was my best thinking. And so I started pursuing a gentleman he was kind of peppering me for years with like little hints. And he was a coach every once in a while at the gym I worked at out here in Austin. And he's an older guy. He's like 25 years older than me, and kind of at that next stage in life. And he was a former Olympic track coach. He's got a lot of A-list athlete clients, flies all over the world, and has this really weird method that I always saw him doing with his athletes. And it kind of looked like some weird version of yoga. And I called him because he kept prodding me. He's like, hey man, when you're ready to talk, let's talk. Like, you're going to hit a rev limit on kind of how well this type of working out works for you. And so I called him. I'm like, dude, I know you said I'd call you one day. This is me calling you that one day. And I'm like, I don't know what to do. I'm scared. I feel like I got to go maybe look at back surgery. And I've had an orthopedist kind of share with me that, hey man, you got some structural stuff going on here, and back surgery may be a really good option for you. And that freaked me out, because we all know back surgery, it's not a high percentage of success. And so he's like, listen, man, I'll work with you, but you got to pretend like you know nothing. And I'm like, okay. That's hard for me, but sure. Like,
Yeah.
I'll buy what you're selling. And he's like, listen, whether or not you do the back surgery, you're still going to have to work with somebody like me. You can go get the surgery and then come work with me after the surgery, or you can work with me now, see if we can avoid the surgery. And so for a year, I gave up everything I thought I knew about lifting weights, and just kind of like took this on faith. And I really trusted the guy, and I'm grateful I did. I didn't touch weights for a year. It started with just floor routines on a yoga mat, doing a lot of body weight exercises, and doing this ELDOA methodology, which is this weird French osteopath named Guy Voyer invented this thing called ELDOA, which I explain to people as like a mashup of Feldenkrais if you were able to self-administer it. Because Feldenkrais is the only other method out there that I think it like works miracles around neuromuscular reeducation in a non-invasive manner. But you do need a practitioner, and you need a really gifted one that can kind of guide you through the coaching. And with ELDOA, you learn the movements to help restructure your fascia, and also to help metabolize damaged tissue as a result of acute injury. But it can all be done at home. It's all self-administered, and it's not really about the practitioner. You need a good one to kind of get you set up, but really the proof is in what you do on your own. And so I would see him, and then he'd give me this homework, and he'd know if I did it or not. Because when I showed up the next time, he would manipulate my tissue. And if the tissue hadn't changed, he knew I hadn't done anything. So I was just really committed to the process. And, about 6 months into it, I started to notice a lot of things changing just beyond my back. Like, the back pain went away very quickly. And that was a huge relief, because initially a lot of this stuff was very uncomfortable. But then I started to be able to work with him on refining the way I moved in general, the way I moved when I was in the gym, ski slopes, hiking, and there were all these inefficiencies that I probably developed as a result of training in this very linear manner, right? Like, when you work out in a gym, you're on flat surfaces and things are stable, and that's not really the way things are out there. So I had to learn to add dynamic components to the way that I work out, and also maintain and repair my tissue. And the reason I'm looking at my lower body is the culprit for a lot of what was going on with me is my psoas had never really been addressed. And I didn't really know how to get to it. I mean, it's way down there. It's awkward to get to. You got to move your guts out of the way. And sometimes you think you're on it, but you're not really on it. And he started to really help me fine tune creating balance in my pelvic floor and learning how to activate my psoas so that when I am under load, I'm using the strongest stabilizing muscles that I have in my body, which are my psoas. It stabilizes my whole trunk. And so now I've got this whole routine that I do with my weight training. So I still lift with weights, but I do it for strength and endurance and for power. And so I have workouts I do across those three spectrums. And then I have a floor routine I do for tissue prepare and repair, which I do independently from the lifting routines. And then I have all these ELDOA movements I do before and after workouts to get my pelvic floor where it needs to be and help make sure that I'm not setting myself up for injury. But if I do get something that goes sideways, which does happen, I now have a whole method for being able to address it myself, which is a huge relief because I don't have to go see the 4 or 5 different practitioners. Not that there's anything wrong with those practitioners, but I can now self audit and self edit. And, like I just had something go on with my trap. It was really uncomfortable. I have a whole routine for subscap and infraspinatus and like the whole shoulder girdle to like loosen it up and get things moving again. So I did that for a week. Everything went away. And it's still surprising when that kind of stuff goes on. And sometimes the back will feel uncomfy. And I have a whole way of treating that so that I don't have to go see a bunch of people and I can do it myself. And it's portable. I do this up in Colorado when I go skiing or do hiking or when I travel. I can do all this in a hotel room. So I'm able to keep my body supple at a level that I've just never been able to before. And I still get to enjoy all the things that I've previously enjoyed doing. I can just do them in a much more careful manner. And, if we think about it in terms of like, hey, when we're 70 years old, what do we want to do with our body? Like, what do we want to have the freedom to do? And when I start there, it makes the decisions I do now very easy to sort of figure out. Because my aspirations at 70 are not doing a snatch. It's not doing a power clean. It's like running around outside, playing with the grandkids, playing with the wife, inside and outside, like kind of basics. And I don't want to have to warm up for 45 minutes or feel like I'm going to tear a hammy when I'm chasing the grandkids around. And I feel like I've now found a thing, like it's the first time in my whole sort of arc where like I feel like I have a thing that really works for me, whether or not I have something go on I don't like.
So what were some of the signs for the edification of others out there who might be experiencing some of them and ignoring them, right? Like what were some of the signs that you mentioned earlier that you wished you'd paid attention to?
So something that I notice a lot of big guys do, because I did it all the time. Whenever I would sit, there was just perpetual discomfort, perpetual tightness. And I was always like kind of moving around and trying to get comfortable. And I mean, you put me on a plane, I felt like I was in a prison. Like any sedentary thing, it just felt like nothing felt right.
Yeah.
And there was this kind of this persistent tightness, tension throughout my entire body, especially in my pelvic floor. And there were always little injuries. There were little things that were bothering me, whether it was an ankle or a knee or neck or back or a shoulder. There was always something that wasn't quite working the way that I wanted it to. And I didn't really know how to address it. And, that went on for years. And then there was also these recurring injuries, especially my lower back, that just kind of kept popping up. And it was never the same thing that caused it. So it was hard to kind of pinpoint, like, was there a movement or an exercise that was creating this kind of culprit to injury? And there just wasn't. But there was always tightness. And, I was also I was super kyphotic as a result of having so much mass. Is like you'd see me sitting at a desk or something. It was like everything was caved in. And so there are some kind of telltale signs for like how people carry their body throughout the day. And, now that I've lost, 50 pounds since I was my largest, and I'm not obsessed with trying to put up as big numbers as possible. And I spend more time repairing and preparing tissue than I do tearing it down or lifting weights. I think that seesaw had to change, right? Like in my 20s, I spent more time working on the physical sort of look of everything. And now I spend more time trying to make sure that the gym is not a place that sets me up for injury. It's a place that sets me up for training for things outside of the gym.
Yeah. And how much of your work now is physical manipulation, rolling things out and that sort of thing versus stretching or something that can be done without equipment?
I mean, the majority of what I do does not require equipment when it comes to tissue prepare and repairing, doing the technical terms here. I start the workout with what I call osteoarticular movements, which essentially is like lubing up the bones. And so I do like ankle circles, knee circles, hip circles. I look like I'm like a hula hoop dancer in the gym, and I certainly
Yeah.
get some looks,
Yeah.
but it warms everything up, right? Like it gets the ligaments, synovial fluid starts to kind of get in between joints and things get supple. And after that, I do a little light exercise to kind of get the blood pumping and get my heart rate up now that my joints, ligaments are kind of gelling. And then I get into the movements, the strength or endurance or power movements. And then after all that's over, when my body is very warm, that's when I do the ELDOA, which is the myofascial restructuring. And then when I do the floor routines or the ones that don't include weights, that is what's called segmental muscular reorganization. And I look like Suzanne Summers on a mat doing leg lifts and stuff. But what I'm doing is I'm hitting all the small muscle groups very specifically so that when I want to recruit all the muscle groups together, everybody is awake.
Yeah. Ready to fire.
I find that to be really, really helpful because especially as dudes, we tend to have some glute ham deficiencies just being men. And I don't know what the science is behind that, but we've all seen guys that have like big pot bellies and no ass.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. Like if we don't use it, we kind of tend to lose it. And so keeping, the posterior chain active, making sure everything's turned on, that's what the segmental muscular reorganization does for me. And for several years before I even lifted, I would do the segmental muscular reorganization before I even touched weights, just because I was trying to make sure I was as warm as possible. I don't have to do that anymore, but it's a big part of how I, keep all the little components moving correctly, both like all the, glute med, glute major, all the glute muscles, all the shoulder girdle muscles. We have these little small muscles around the shoulders, and I can often end up flipping like ligaments and stuff by doing Olympic movements. And if I don't warm things up appropriately, I'm not going to get to do those movements.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you talking about some of your movements and the preparing for the major lifts and that sort of thing, at least the way that you're doing it now. Longtime listeners may remember Danny Dreyer, who came up with chi running many, many moons ago. And he's one of my favorite people. And he had posted just a couple of months ago a scan, I think it was an x-ray of his knees after, like coming up on 70 years of ultra running, all sorts of mileage, where many people are trashed after just a few years of running marathons, at least the traditional way. But I remember one of the things that I learned from him was to do very similar movements as to what you're talking about. Circling, and it looks ridiculous, right? When you're like circling your ankles and then you go up to the knees and the hips and the rest of the body. It looks very, very silly. But that scan of his knee was on point. There was pretty much no damage, no injury, no signs of wear and tear that were obvious anyway. And he's still out there hitting it. So it's like, that's what I want to be doing when I'm 70 or 80. Not necessarily running ultra marathons,
No,
but
I will never be an ultra guy. I have
right.
mad respect for it. I mean, it's absolute insanity, but it's so brutal on the body. And I
Absolutely.
think what you're kind of getting at, especially talking about the guy's knee, kind of the goal with my whole thing, like if we water it down into a simple phrase, it's I'm just trying to create space in the body. And, for the initial sort of period after the injury, it was space between vertebrae, right? Like I had so much compression from beating up my body and squatting and doing all these crazy things in the gym. I had to go the opposite direction and start to lengthen out my spine again, which is a very slow, very methodical process that can't be expedited. And that's the same thing with anybody that's like an ultra marathon runner, right? Like the pounding of the joints, if they're able to create space, they could feasibly run into their 70s, right? And it's the repeated pounding and the compression without relief that I think creates a lot of the injury that we see happen in gyms as people get into their mid, late 30s and early 40s.
What else have you seen in terms of just talking about, the years ticking by a little bit in other people who are, and you don't have to use any specific examples, obviously, but other people who are kind of like pursuing performance, but then hit that red line and have to correct or completely give up? Like what have you seen? What have you learned?
Well, I think the hardest part is like admitting it's not working.
Yeah.
For years, I kind of knew it was not working really well, but I wasn't really sure what to do about it. And so now I'm acutely sensitive to when things don't feel right so that I can make adjustments to what I'm doing in the gym. Because I can be guilty as anybody of kind of going through the motions and wanting to get something out of my workout. And if my body is not in a place to push it at that level, I have to respect it. And that's a big difference than, my teens or my 20s where, I didn't need to even warm up. I just kind of bear down and grind through workouts no matter how I was feeling. And there was like very little risk of injury. Whereas today, there's a lot of risk. And I still do very technical things in the gym where I can hurt myself. And it just isn't worth it anymore.
And I would assume that there's a lot more body sensing going on where you're using some of the things that you've learned to kind of go into different parts of the body and try to understand what's happening, whether it hurts or not. Whereas before that, and we're all kind of guilty of this, it's like, oh, yeah, a little like twinge here and there. It feels a little off. Let's just go. Let's hit it. And that can eventually lead to your own demise. So, how has that thinking changed and how have you adapted?
Well, not to get like super off into the weeds, but part of my reason that I hurt myself in the gym is I'm a bit neurotic about working out, and probably had some body image stuff going on in my 20s. And there was an unhealthy relationship with this like guilt, shame if I don't work out, and what that meant about what I could eat. And it was just this whole weird wheel. And I had to really kind of come to terms with all of that so that when I am trying to honor my body with what I do with it, I can also listen to it, which means I have to be in tune with myself. And for me, that means I have to have some kind of spiritual practice with meditation, quietness. And I'm not signaling a religious thing here, but if I don't have a relationship with me where I can listen to myself and hear that still small voice that's kind of our inner monologue, that's when I've presented myself for opportunities to hurt my body because I'm not checking in. And I've learned that I have to listen to that intuition because the consequence is injury when it comes to working out and exercise. And not just working out, like, I've gotten really into skiing again over the last few years. And I had to have a similar conversation with myself this last season. I'm like, is it really that important that I try to get to the bottom of the hill as fast as humanly possible? Like, who is that helping? And am I putting myself and other people at risk in that process? Yes. Is the goal for me to be on that mountain and be a good steward of this playground we all get to enjoy? Yes. What's that mean? I need to provide a safe environment for myself and others. And that is the same way I look at the gym now. Like, I need to provide a safe environment for myself when I'm in the gym and also for other people. So I need to not set an example that is moronic.
Mhm. And the body image stuff, especially in the world of bodybuilding, is so common, or even in CrossFit, in athletics. What and I would imagine I've never been on stage in a bodybuilding competition or anything like that, or gotten down to 3.5% body, single digit body fat to that low extreme. But I would imagine, and a lot of people have experienced this, that like from that point forth, you're comparing your aesthetics or what your body's supposed to look like to standing on the podium that one day, which is a tiny, tiny little snapshot, which is not something where you can actually walk around that way for the rest of the year, and certainly not for the rest of your life. So how is that something that you've managed, or other people who you've been around have been able to navigate in I guess a more positive way?
No, I mean, it's a really good question. And I know when we did the last show like 10 years ago, probably the most surprising part of going through that experience and doing the show was after the show. And for about 2 months after the show, I mean, if you put me in front of a plate of food, there was no off button.
Right. I remember this. It
Yeah.
was
I mean,
insane.
it was a little scary, and I'd never had this like lack of control with how much food I was consuming, but I would eat until I got sick, like until I would throw up. And I was like, what in the heck is this? This is very weird. And after about a week, and I could tell it wasn't really leveling out, I was like, man, this is kind of concerning. And I called somebody that, specializes in eating disorders. And, they helped me feel like, okay, listen, you're not crossing the invisible line here, but this is something you need to pay attention to. And so I kind of tracked it real close and started to notice after the first 3 to 4 weeks, it started to kind of diminish, and eventually things kind of got back to a normative level. But I could see that if, for me and the way that my brain is made up, like if I'd gotten on a circuit of doing 2 to 3 shows a year, which is what a lot of people do that do these with regularity, I mean, I could see in a couple of years, I have a completely distorted image of my own body. My relationship with food and nutrition would have just been real sideways. And so for me, I was like, A, I'm never doing a show again. Like that was the most unhealthy thing I've ever done to myself.
Yeah.
And B, holy moly, I can see how twisted and kind of perverted this can get for people, because you're chasing an ideal that you only can capture for 2 to 3 hours. And that is it. Like you look that way at the leanest, driest that you want to look for a few hours, and then it starts changing very quickly. So it's completely unrealistic to want to hang on to that. And I wasn't even like that interested in looking that lean, but the body changes almost immediately. And it was like the next day I woke up, I looked a little softer. The day after the show. And then every day thereafter, a little extra here, a little extra there. And I'd look at the scale, and, I think I gained 20 pounds in the first couple of weeks. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I had no idea how much training for this type of an event would just throttle kind of all these things I love about working out and exercise. And so it took me a couple of months to land the plane, but it also gave me this really interesting window into what it might feel like to have an eating disorder.
Yeah.
And I never want to go back to that. Like that was no bueno.
That invisible line, as you say, like you might not know when you're crossing it. Any of us might not know, because
like I didn't realize I'd already drifted over there, and I was like kind of dancing on the perimeter, not like, crossing over into doing anything bulimic or starving myself. But there were just a lot of, I can't eat that. It's going to do this to me, and it's going to affect the body this way. And I had to really kind of release that stuff and kind of get back in touch with the just eating and lifting that I love to do. And I got back there eventually, but it also was just valuable to kind of have done a bodybuilding show, which was sort of a bucket list thing for me, and to also recognize the absolute lack of health in that process.
Yeah.
And, I'm not interested in ever doing it again.
Yeah. And that line, as you talk about being a lifelong fitness and athletics enthusiast and participant, certainly a health nut, crossing over into orthorexia, which if you're going to be on stage in some sort of bodybuilding competition or other competitions, serves you until it doesn't, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it looks good for that environment, but it makes the world very small outside. And I tell this story. I remember I thought for a minute, like I need to date somebody from this space.
Yeah, super common.
Not fun dating.
No.
Trying to go out to dinner, and like one of you is eating out of a Tupperware container, and the other one's like kind of bitter and resentful. You get to have pancakes, and it's just like, man, this is just a bizarre reality.
Yeah.
because I love food, as you well know. And half of the reason I like working out is I like to eat.
And what does that look like now compared to, I guess your not necessarily the bodybuilding days, but before that, the strength based days? Because you could take down a pound of cheese in one sitting. Like I've been there, I've seen it. It's amazing.
Well, so something that, I've dealt with over the last couple of years have been some GI stuff. And I think, it's just a hypothesis. Should I be that surprised? I've had some GI stuff pop up when for years I was eating 10 to 15,000 calories a day, even though I was in my 20s. Like that kind of stuff, we pay for those kinds of decisions at some point. And so at this point, I've had some GI things go on and I got some peptides that's super helpful. And for me, it's about nutrient timing. So there are uh, certainly frameworks like during the week, during the work week, like Monday to Friday, I tend to do intermittent fasting. Like it's almost 1 o'clock here in Austin, and I haven't had anything to eat today. I've just had coffee and a little butter. And so for me, that's like very functional during the day. Like I'm scheduled pretty tight and I don't really get hungry. And then I tend to work out later in the afternoon around 4 or 5, sometimes as late as 6. And then my feeding window tends to start after the workout,
Okay, so not before.
not before. I might have like a bone broth shake, something light protein, not super heavy. But I just don't get hungry anymore because I've been doing this for so long this way. And then my feeding window starts after my workout. I usually have 2 to 3 meals after. Try to cut off the feeding by ideally like 9. Some usually though not till 10. I'm trying to pare that back a little bit because I know I shouldn't be eating that late. But pandemic, I developed some snacking habits.
Yeah. Ah, you're not alone, good sir.
Not alone. I started like baking and like really got into funfetti cake. So that's a topic for another time. But that's kind of what it's like Monday to Friday. And then on the weekends, it pretty much stays the same. Sometimes I loosen up a little bit. Maybe I go get brunch or something. It's not a punitive thing anymore. Like during the week, it's purely function. And I just like not having to think about food. It's just one less thing to think about. And then during the weekend, it mostly follows suit. Sometimes it changes a little bit. And so to me, so far, like that kind of works with my body. I mean, sometimes I'll feel like I'm bonking a little bit and I'll get some butter or some other form of healthy fat. Sometimes it's a little electrolyte balance that needs to happen. So I'll grab like a pinch of, Himalayan salt or Celtic sea salt, which I don't know if, listeners, if you've never experienced with salt, it is a magical substance that has all sorts of amazing abilities to do different things in the body. Like it's something I discovered recently, having a little bit of a sweet tooth at night. I throw a little salt in my mouth, sweet tooth gone. Like there are all these little hacks with salt that I love.
Yeah, and a lot of people miss the boat on the salt piece. It's easy to. It's like, oh, I'm
It's a
already
big
getting enough.
topic right now, right? Like hydration and all these, different little packets with electrolytes and different things. And also people are getting more nerdy about just water itself. That's something for me in the last year that's become a kind of an interesting exploration. Like I used to never even notice that sink water tasted weird. Now I smell my water before I drink it. Like I'm a sommelier. And there's a difference. Like I won't even drink the water out of my sink in my apartment anymore. Like I got to go to Whole Foods and get the good pH stuff and, the taste and quality of the water and how it affects my, like I actually notice now.
It's certainly a nutrient of its own kind, and you got to be careful with it because most of it is trash, even if it's from bottles. Even if you're spending $6 for a bottle of water, there's no guarantee that it's going to be much better than the crap that's coming out of your tap. And there is so much gnarliness in the
Which
tap
is
water.
kind of a good segue to just like, the health thing. It's not just about what we do in the gym and how we stretch and what we supplement, but it's what we drink and also our environment. Like something over the last 2 years, especially with all the COVID stuff, like I've swapped out every cleaning product I have, swapped out some towels, I've swapped out bed sheets. Like, I'm trying to create an environment that is conducive to health.
Hmm. So you mentioned peptides a little bit, and I know your experience has been very positive, and some people are very familiar with the conversation, which has been happening for longer than most people realize. But when you're talking about synthetic substances, some of them are better understood than others. It's kind of still the Wild West. So maybe you could talk about your experience and your take on where peptides are going, also as a potential therapy.
Yeah, totally. So, uh, kind of for some backstory, like I've never taken any gear, I've never been on any performance enhancing drugs. Like, not, I don't really have an opinion on it. It's just not been a part of my story. And I was looking at potentially getting on exogenous testosterone. And the reason I was looking at doing it is I got COVID for the second time around Christmas last year. And I had these GI symptoms that just never really went away. I got a little bit better when the fever lifted, but I just had this persistent thing going on and it's really uncomfortable. And I had done some research and read that sometimes elevating your testosterone levels can kind of increase healing in the GI tract. I've always avoided getting on testosterone just because I don't want to mess with my own natural production and I don't want to certainly be beholden to being on it and jabbing myself with testosterone for the rest of my life. And I started looking at peptides as an alternative and talking with a few folks and found, like some interesting connections between peptides like BPC 157 and KPV. One is an injectable or a troche, the other is a capsule. And they kind of work in concert together to help realign the GI tract with new blood vessels, which increases healing. And I'm like, man, that sounds great. Also reduces inflammation. I was having some like bloating and distended stomach stuff go on, which I'd never experienced before. And then I also read about CJC 1295 with ipamorelin, which for a guy that loves working out, you say growth hormone, I smile. Like,
Sure.
it sounds exciting. Like, okay, yeah, I'll try some of that. So there certainly was a little part of my brain that's like, okay, I'm getting on these three peptides. They all increase testosterone and growth hormone. And of course, there's all these other healing properties. But I was kind of excited about it. And so I found a really high quality compounding pharmacy, two of them here in the Southwest, that were able to do injectables and troches or dissolvable tablets. I'm not big on jabbing myself. I'm sure there's a little more efficacy with the injectable peptides, but it's very negligible at this point. So I did all these dissolvable tablets for those three peptides. And within the first week, probably about 70% of my GI symptoms were gone. And the inflammation in my gut, gone. Like measurable difference. And I tried a lot of things. I even ended up in the ER around Christmas Eve because I was having some real weird stuff happen. And of course, nothing happened at the hospital. Unless something's fallen off and they got to sew it back on, they just kind of like pat you on the back and send you home. So that was kind of an interesting experience. But I've now been on the peptides for a little over 6 months, and it's been a tangible difference. There's also been very tangible differences in the gym. And I started to kind of notice the best way to describe it is it often feels like I'm 18 when I go into the gym now.
Interesting.
And I've had to remind myself to do my osteoarticular movements and warm up my body because I have that same feeling that I did when I was younger, where I could just walk in cold and bend a bar in half. And I've always had intense workouts, but as I've gotten a little older, I've noticed I need to kind of like get myself a little more ramped up. And sometimes I just don't feel the same level of intensity. But now that intensity is back, and I've also noticed, getting into those last couple of repetitions, I can just keep going. The fatigue does not happen the same way that it did prior to being on the peptides. My guess is that sort of experience is related to the CJC and the ipamorelin, which are, I think, increasing the production of ghrelin, which is a growth hormone factor released when you eat. I'm not a scientist or a doctor, so I'm doing my best here. And I think that is a big reason why I'm feeling some of the fatigue differences, muscle soreness differences, and also just that feeling of like I can keep going. which I really love. And my recovery has certainly gotten shorter. And I've probably put on 10 pounds lean muscle. So I got on the peptides at like 195, and now I'm like 205, 210. And it's been a couple of years since I've been at that size. And with all the GI stuff, I was starting to lose weight, which has never really been my problem. My problem has always been I love eating and lifting. And if I don't watch it, I just magically grow. And that's been kind of happening again, which has been fun. There's also been like other things I've noticed too, like skin, hair, teeth, nails. Like it has made a global effect. And if anything hurts, that BPC is awesome. I mean, it attacks inflammation in a way that is impressive. And as far as I know, and I've done a good amount of research on this, but I'm certainly not a medical professional or credentialed as an MD. At least the three that I'm on, like there are no downstream negative effects that I can identify. There are thousands of peptides, and some of them do have some potential side effects. But I have been really careful to only try peptides that really have nothing negative to present.
Very interesting.
Bad news about peptides right now is the FDA is, as of the end of September, trying to figure out how to get the most popular and effective peptides into pharmaceuticals. So I've been stocking up on peptides with the compounding pharmacies. I've gotten them from here, but I don't have any more renewals. So, I never wanted to be on these forever anyway. They've just been so effective. I'm a little nervous to run out, but it's also an opportunity to kind of figure out the next step in this process of healing my gut and my body. Let's look at it. But highly recommend, you just got to get it from a good source. You got to make sure you get it, don't go online and just buy it from some rando peptide site. Super recommend finding a local pharmacy that can compound the peptides.
Mm-hmm. That's very prudent advice. We have a few minutes left here, Chaz. Let's talk about where health is going for you as an investor and someone who's been playing in the business of health, fitness, athletics, and the rest of this. You've got a very cool gym project in New York City. Wherever you want to go with this, let's talk about what's happening next.
Now, the gym project's kind of a good example. So I opened a gym with a couple of partners in Chelsea, Manhattan in June. And it's been going super well. And kind of the vision and concept there was the gym environment's really changed post-COVID. And there are now all these options for revenue that were not previously available through telehealth and telemedicine. And so we started doing drips in July, and we're selling out of those like crazy every week. And now we're kind of looking at, do we want to do hormones? Do we want to do microbiome, genetics? But the great part about it is we don't have to do those. Like we can go find the providers with the platforms, negotiate a rev share, but for the consumer or our patrons and members, they see that as all coming through the window of the gym, even if it's not us providing those services. But before the pandemic, if you wanted to provide medical services in that kind of environment, you had to have a practitioner on site, and there were all these restrictions. And of course, there was a pretty big regulatory and compliance risk if you're a gym doing medical services. And now a lot of that has changed as a result of telehealth and telemedicine. So we have fully prescriptive class 2 medical devices in the gym. And that's a direct current electric stimulator called the Newbie. And the guy who invented that equipment lives here in Austin. I've known him for like a decade. So we got 8 of those there. And part of the reason we got that arranged is we have a prescriptive medical device which classifies us as an essential business. So that's a little bit of insulation if God, willing, hopefully there's never another shutdown again. If there was, we wouldn't have to close our doors. But really it's a gym first, with memberships and training. And then we have all these additional medical services that we're kind of bringing to the table as well. And we have kind of innovative medical equipment that we're using in the gym for rehab and for performance. And we're in the middle of Chelsea, which just gives us kind of this like showroom floor dynamic where we can try a lot of different things and get feedback very quickly. And so I've seen that as a major shift in the fitness facility space. Is no longer acceptable to just be a gym if you're considered on the higher end of things. There just has to be more there, which is good for gym owners. And for members, it allows them to have less places to go. They don't have to go to the doctor's office and the gym and. A lot of this can just happen within the lens of the gym itself. And then in terms of healthcare, I mean, there's just so much going on right now in healthcare as we move more and more towards value-based care. I get really excited about that because then medical professionals are getting incentivized to get people healthier and get people or into control if we're dealing with chronic disease. And so I get excited about some of those changes in dynamics. Of course, I think medicine as a whole has some, pretty big things they got to kind of work through and figure out. Whether or not we do, I don't know. I don't have any control over that either, but I am involved in a medical practice as a partner, and we do treat chronic disease, and we're trying to change medicine from within. And our secret sauce is we just talk to our patients every day. And I know that sounds simplistic, and we dress it up. We have social workers, and we can address mood and behavioral disorders, and that's part of why we have this high touch point environment. But when we're dealing with low income and rural communities on federally subsidized health insurance plans, those are the people that need the most help and are not getting it. And so we're able to come in and provide that high touch, white glove experience when they normally would never even have access to it. And so I think that's something too I see changing, is we're starting to really identify the problem is not that we don't have like medical options or patients that need medical options, is we don't have enough people providing the options to help the people that need the help. And so we are alleviating that stress with this healthcare practice. And I feel like we need more of that. We need more efficiency inside the medical space.
Absolutely. A one-stop shop where people can go and get healthy instead of the sick care system that we've been looking at.
Well, and not have to go in a hospital all the time. Like if you get a cold, don't go to the hospital, right? But that's the beautiful part of telehealth and telemed is if people embrace it, not only are we going to stop burdening hospitals, because my opinion, hospitals need to be for heavy and serious stuff. Things are not working correctly. You need to go to a hospital, but that's not where you go to get a cold addressed. And I think if we can lower the pressure on these fixed assets, hospitals, then maybe eventually the cost of healthcare starts to go down. But insurance is going to have to always make money. It's a for-profit business. And so if their cost basis starts to drop, meaning like they get to close big giant facilities, then maybe eventually that cost savings gets passed on to the end user. But who knows?
We all could use that. Well, right on. Chaz, this has been so much fun catching up with you. What is the best place for people to find you and whatever you're doing next?
Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll give you my personal email, and then I'll also share just a scheduling link if anybody wants to hop on for 15 or 30 minutes. Like I love talking about this stuff, and I'm happy to offer that to any of your listeners.
Cool. Right on. So Chaz, once more, I can't believe it's been 10 years, but I'm so honored to be your friend and be
we still
along
got
for the
hair.
ride.
We still got hair.
We still got hair for now anyway. All right, man. Thanks so much for joining us here today.
Thanks, Abel. You're the best.
Hey there, thanks so much for joining us on this episode of the Fat Burning Man Show. Before you go, please hit like and subscribe, or even better, leave us a quick review, which helps other people find their way to this free show. We've recorded over 400 episodes of this award-winning show over the past decade and change, and you can watch every single episode for free at fatburningman.com. So if you can think of a friend or a family member who might enjoy and benefit from our work, please take a quick second to share it with someone you care about. Thank you so much for all of your reviews, comments, likes, emails, and the kind words you send our way. We couldn't do any of this without you. Now, a quick disclaimer. The Fat Burning Man Show provides general information and discussions about health and related subjects and is not intended as medical advice, nor is the information a substitute for professional medical expertise, diagnosis, or treatment. If you or any other person has a medical concern, I wholeheartedly encourage you to consult with your healthcare provider. Now, before I sign off, don't forget to join our newsletter at fatburningman.com. When you sign up with your email, I'll send you a wild quick start guide along with a few of our ridiculously tasty recipes. This is Abel James signing off. Thanks so much for listening and have a great week.